You can never have too many knives. And in this case, knives are books. Minasan ohayo gozaimasu. My name is the Advocate, and on this day, I see clearly because I'm an advocate for Last Argument of Kings, a book review. Things are getting pretty crazy here in Ottawa, so I decided to hole up here in the Palace of the Agriant until things subside a bit. Will things subside enough to allow me to do a proper review of this book? We shall see. Last Argument of Kings is the third and final book in the First Law trilogy written by Joe Abercrombie. It was released on March 20, 2008, and I've got quite a few subjective things to say about this book. Did I enjoy it? Is it worth your time? You'll have to stay tuned. But while you're tuned, if you could do me a huge favor and leave a like on this video, comment below, and consider subscribing to my channel. I'm a very small channel, and I could use all the breadcrumbs I can get. Your subscriptions really do help me out in terms of discovery. I would really appreciate it, guys. Also, if you've watched my previous First Law book review videos, which I kindly ask you to do so because I'll be spoiling the first two First Law books in this video, then you know the drill by now. Part 1 of this video will contain my spoiler-free thoughts with regards to Last Argument of Kings. Part 2 will contain my spoiler-full thoughts with regards to this book and this trilogy as a whole. Timestamps are located below. Let's roll. So this is it, the conclusion to the First Law trilogy. An immersive story which I personally found to be the most interesting book in the trilogy. A very well-written, thematically rich, character-driven book. Which also killed my desire to ever reread this trilogy. Ever again. Oh, are you serious, Advocate? Are you trying to do a hot take right now? What the heck are you smoking, man? So as we've previously discussed, Joe Abercrombie is often viewed as the king of grimdark fantasy. Well, I mean, he didn't pioneer the genre or anything like that, but he has definitely taken the grimdark torch and ran with it since his first book back in 2006. He's a very talented author who is skilled with his grimdark tools, and he relishes in the genre like none other. He's great at what he writes, and what he writes is great. It just isn't for me. Now, I haven't read Robert Howard or H.P. Lovecraft, so this opinion might come across as an exaggeration, but Joe Abercrombie's Last Argument of Kings is quite possibly the grimmest, darkest book I've ever read. Not just in this trilogy, but in general as well, and it's just a little too much for me. Now, there's nothing wrong with Joe having written a very grim book. People have been doing that for ages, and there's something curiously intriguing about taking a peek at the darker side of the fantasy genre. The first two books in the series also had their fair share of grimdark, and I didn't complain about it once then. However, I think the grimdark is more stomachable in those books because the darkness, for lack of a better term, is properly balanced out by a fair bit of humor. Joe's comedic timing is spot on in those books, and he expertly ties the comedic moments into his narrative so that the story doesn't feel suffocated by too much darkness. Last Argument of Kings for sure still has levity interspersed into the story to help prevent things from becoming overly depressing, but Joe also adds a rather nihilistic edge to this book, which becomes extraordinarily pronounced with the ending, and I think pushes things a little too over the top grimdark for my own subjective tastes. Now, removing myself completely from the equation and looking at this book specifically from an objective point of view, Joe did a mostly fantastic job with writing the grimdark story he intended to write. After reading this book, it's very clear to me that Joe had his heart set out on an ending from the very beginning and set up everything in the first two books to reach that goalpost in the third book. He didn't change anything midstream for the sake of grimdark shock value. He naturally builds up to an ending that, for the most part, satisfyingly recontextualizes several events from the first two books. However, I would say Joe's execution of the ending here does come at a price. A few plot elements from the first two books are thrown away in favor of the ending we receive here, and I don't think it was wholly necessary to trash those components, but I'm getting ahead of myself, and we'll cover that more fully in the spoiler section. Now, on the topic of the plot, I do appreciate how atypical the story has been up to this point in the trilogy, and Last Argument of Kings is no different. Joe has done a wonderful job in creating a unconventional yet engaging story all the same, and it makes for a rather memorable read. Even Mr. Logan Ninefingers makes mention as to how unusual his journey has been since the start of the series, and it's quite entertaining to see him reflect in an almost meta sense on Joe's writing. So I went south and I fell in with this wizard. I went a sort of journey with him across the sea and far away to find some kind of a thing which, when we got there, weren't there. It all sounded more than a bit mad now he said it.
What kind of a thing?
Do you know what? Logan sucked at his teeth, tasting of drink. I can't say that I really know. They all looked at each other as if they'd never heard such a damn fool story, and Logan had to admit they probably hadn't. I actually have no problems with the book story, which despite it being the longest book in the trilogy, is actually paced pretty well with very few to no dead spots. It's really just the ending and how it disposes of certain aspects of the story that leaves me a little bit bewildered rather than bemused. However, one thing I'm not bewildered by, but rather buoyant of, are this book's characters. I've already endlessly praised my fondness for the series' main characters in my previous First Law videos, but it must be said again, Joe is a master of character writing, and Last Argument of Kings is no different. Logan, Glokta, Jazal all feel like fully realized characters with their own quirks, and it's easy to slip into their mindsets when reading their respective POV chapters. Obviously, because this is Grimdark, they all exhibit various shades of grey, but because these characters are so well written, we're able to see how each of them is able to justify some of the more morally questionable things they do in this very morally questionable world.
When was it exactly that I became this? By small degrees, I suppose. One act presses hard upon another, on a path we have no choice but to follow, and each time there are reasons. We do what we must. We do what we are told. We do what is easiest. What else can we do but solve one sordid problem at a time? Then one day we look up and find that we are this.
He looked at the blood gleaming on his boot.
Ah, well, I would love to spend more time on philosophy, but I have officials to bribe and noblemen to blackmail and votes to rig and secretaries to murder and lovers to threaten.
Even Pharaoh shines some in this book. Despite some misgivings I had with her character here is the strongest it's ever been in the series. Well, until the ending, but we'll cover her, the other characters, and my overall feelings on how this book's ending affects these characters here shortly. Which I think makes for a perfect segue to delve into spoilers! If you haven't read Last Argument of Kings, feel free to click on the timestamps below to skip ahead to the conclusion of this video to hear my overall thoughts on this book. If you have read Last Argument of Kings, then stick around for my spoiler thoughts.
Yes, I am greater than Juvens. I am greater than Hughes himself.
So I've beat around the bush long enough. Let's dissect this ending. Baez was the ultimate big villain all along, and in the end he walks away winning, but not before rubbing his power in the faces of the other characters who are ultimately nothing more than pawns in his battle against Khalul. Logan, Jazal, Glokta, Pharaoh, they all sort of reset back to a status quo of sorts as Joe purports a rather depressing message that history is just a vicious repetitive cycle. There's no point in trying to better yourself as a human being because at the end of the day the world is unfair and the only way to survive is to obey your master, in this case Baez, or die a painful death. A joyful, happy message. Now, this is a very, very brave way to end a story, and I'm still thinking about this ending days after I finished reading this book, so Joe must have done something right. I applaud Joe on maintaining firm to his nihilistic theme. He intertwines his grimdark message very well with the narrative and successfully subverts expectations by taking long-established fantasy tropes and turning them on their head. After all, I mean, what's more head-turning than the wise Gandalf Magi being just a giant asshole at the end of the day? However, I'm not gonna mince words. I was left somewhat dissatisfied with this ending, and part of that dissatisfaction does stem from my own personal disagreement with Joe's nihilistic philosophy here. Yes, the real world is a very unfair place, and bad people do get away with doing bad things all the time. However, we as a human race should strive continuously to better ourselves as people rather than just giving up and saying, well, the bad people get away with everything. There's no point to bettering myself as a person because that's only going to get me hurt. Might as well just give in to this unfair system. It's a very cowardly mantra to live by in real life, and it's a cowardly mantra for this story as well. But okay, I didn't agree with this book's message, and that's fine. A book doesn't have to align with one's own personal views for it to be considered a good book. So setting apart my subjective opinion and looking at this book objectively, does the ending of Last Argument of Kings make sense within the logical context that this series had previously set up? I would say yeah. Yeah, for the most part it does. Baez, being the ultimate puppet master, successfully recontextualizes many of the events that took place in both the blade itself and before they are hanged. When I first reviewed the blade itself, I was questioning a few of the scenes in that book because they seemed to not at all be relevant to what I believed was the central narrative of this story, which was the war with Bethod. However, looking back on it, I realize now that the war with Bethod was ultimately secondary. It was really the stuff in Gurkle and the foreshadowing about the banks that was truly the relevant stuff, and those were the things that were all part of Baez's plan. And although I don't really have an interest in rereading this series, largely because I'm not a fan of the nihilist message, the Baez plot twist does incentivize second read-throughs because now with the knowledge of this twist, we are more clearly able to see how the Magi truly manipulated everything from the start. Chapter 50 of this book, very appropriately titled Answers, covers most of Baez's puppeteering throughout the trilogy, and it's so fun to look back on it in hindsight, what with him influencing the result of Jazal's contest, having Jazal take part in this grand adventure to Shibolyan, and even handing money out to Glokta and Dagoska to help him battle the Gurkish. But even in this book, there are several foreshadowing clues that point to Baez being more suspicious than the wise father figure facade that he puts on.
A heavy hand slapped suddenly down on Jazal's shoulder. I told you it would be sooner rather than later, my boy. Jazal slowly turned his head, a feeling of terrible dismay boiling up from his stomach, and there was the first of the Magi, grinning to his face from a distance of no more than a foot. Very much present, after all. It was no surprise, really, that the bald old meddler was involved in this. Strange and painful events seemed to follow in his wake like stray dogs barking behind the butcher's wagon. Did you kill Juvens? Yulway's whisper hissed through the darkness. Did you kill our master? Baez did not flinch. I made mistakes long ago. Many mistakes, I know. Some out in the ruined west. Some here in this place. The day does not pass in which I do not regret them. I fought with Khalul. I ignored my master's wisdom. I trespassed in the house of the Maker. I fell in love with his daughter. I was proud and vain and rash, all this is true, but I did not kill Juvens. Very well. Yulway let fall his hand from Baez's arm. Mamoon lied then. Khalul lied. We will fight against them together. Good, my old friend, good. I knew that I could trust you as you can trust me. Pharaoh curled her lip. Trust. It was a word that only liars used. A word the truthful had no need of.
Baez is, at the end of the day, a power-hungry, self-obsessed egomaniac. He may have had the best of intentions when he was Juven's young apprentice long ago, but his lust for power ultimately consumed him, and now he only cares to sate his own ego by using those around him to attempt to rid himself of Khalul once and for all. And use the people around him he does because he outright ruins several of our main characters' lives with his mere existence. How so? Well, we have an easily replaceable Puppet King in Jazal and an easily replaceable Archlector in Glokta who are under the thumb of their cruel and merciless master lest their bodies wind up by the docks. We have a queen who is forced against her will and sexuality to sleep with the king and give him heirs lest her real love interest wind up with her body by the docks. We have a lot of lost northern lives whose bodies aren't in the docks but in the mud after a bloody battle with Khalul's Gurkish. And we have a promoted but disfigured body in Colonel West who is unnecessarily afflicted by a disease unleashed by Baez hypocritically breaking the first law. We end the story with victory for one vile man and a rather unceremonious ending for everyone else. Oh, that Baez. Now, although this book's grimdark ending does work when looking at how everything was set up in the prior books, I don't quite think Joe pulls everything off perfectly with this ending here. For one, we are left with a lot of questions with regards to Logan Ninefingers' Jekyll and Hyde personality and not many answers. It's a little strange for me because Joe spends quite a few chapters having Baez intricately explain all the previously mentioned machinations and how they were necessary for the Magi's grand master plan, yet Logan's story remains shrouded in mystery despite Baez having ordered Bethod to leave Logan alive. I mean, it's clear to me that Joe is a writer who likes to tie up loose ends, but why tie up everything about Baez but not really delve into the Ninefingers' bipolar conundrum? Now maybe Joe does delve more fully into Logan's backstory in one of the follow-up standalone novels, but as far as this trilogy is concerned, we're left with more questions than answers. And on the topic of Logan, his whole feud with Bethod, which I originally thought would be the predominant thorough line that binds this trilogy, really ultimately turns out to be insignificant in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to Adwa's war with the Gurkish. Joe does give gravitas to Logan's duel with the long built up to the Feared in this book, but after Logan delves into his Nine Fingers personality and unceremoniously kills the Feared and Bethod, the whole thing is kind of swept away and we quickly move on from that to the battle in Adwa. I won't say it's anticlimactic, but it was rather abrupt, to the point that by the end of the book I was questioning what the whole point of the Northern plotline was in the first place. Additionally, when looking at the context of this story, why would Baez want the Union to go to war with the North? Baez ultimately knew he was going to do battle with Khalul, so wouldn't he want to conserve as many of the Union forces as possible to do battle with the Gurkish instead of with Bethod? Why didn't he just outright kill Bethod in the Blade itself, avoid the war, claim that Logan killed Bethod, and have Logan be his puppet Northern King in order to have Northern forces ally with the Union from the beginning in order to help him defeat the Gurkish? I guess you could also say that Baez was more hyper-focused on using the Seed as his weapon against Khalul and didn't really find it necessary to deal with Bethod then and there, but I don't know. I think there were more elegant ways to handle the Northern storyline than what we eventually got. Pharaoh as well, I was left questioning what the point of her story was. I will fully admit she's never been my favorite character in this trilogy, but the Last Argument of Kings definitely brings out some interesting aspects about her character. She really comes into her own here as she realizes that there's no joy in revenge, and she also sees right through Baez and even develops a superpower of her own by being able to listen in on the whispers of the spirits from the other side. But at the end of the day, she winds up doing nothing with that power and instead decides to go back south to kill some Gurkish soldiers. It's a little bit regressive. Now, don't get me wrong, this problem is not just unique to Pharaoh. Despite some character growth, virtually every other character also kind of goes back to the status quo, but I don't know, after obtaining her powers, I expected more from Pharaoh's character, besides killing Mamoon anyway. Pharaoh essentially just functions as our eyes and ears into Baez's drunken power ramblings while he's destroying Adwa with his demon tornado and nothing more. It would have been more appropriate if Pharaoh were to have pushed Baez from the parapet of the building and poetically killed Baez the same way he killed Canadius and Ptolemy all those years ago. But I suppose if Joe had given Pharaoh this character moment, then it would have ultimately undermined Joe's overall theme about the world being subservient to a master and change being pointless. So can't kill Baez, so that means Pharaoh gets sacrificed here. However, if Joe had to write a story that abided by the nihilist message, then he did that very well in this book. Regardless of development, our characters at the end of the day remain in depressingly hopeless situations, and all they can do is live out the rest of their days until they receive the sweet embrace of death.
And freedom is far overrated in any case. We all have our responsibilities. We all owe something to someone. Only the entirely worthless are entirely free. The worthless and the dead.
A very dispiriting conclusion. So all in all, Last Argument of Kings is a very grim, very dark, but very immersive read. Your mileage will vary depending on how big of a fan you are of Grimdark, not just with this book, but with the overall nihilistic message of this book as well. However, it's clear that Joe certainly thought through the grimdark elements of this story, and he should be rightfully lauded for his storytelling abilities. He's a talented writer, and although I do have some nitpicks with regards to the structure of the first book and the handling of a few plot threads here in this third book as well, I think the trilogy is worth checking out at least once, especially if you're a fantasy fan and are looking for something with more of a dark edge to it. But with that said, thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this video and sticking with me throughout this entire trilogy. I really do appreciate you. You guys know what's up. Like, comment, subscribe. I would for sure like to check out some of Joe's standalone novels in the future, especially since I hear they expand on some of the plot elements from this trilogy. However, I think I'll leave the first lobby for now and check out a new series for my next set of videos. Until then, thank you once again for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll see you guys next time. The Advocate,